Thank you so much to everyone for joining us for this Coffee and Books. I'm so excited um, to talk about How the Water Holds Me with Tariq Luthun. And Tariq has his shay. I unfortunately don't have either tea nor coffee, but I have the book and I have the joy for the book. So I'm really excited. So let me give a brief introduction to Tariq. Tariq Luthun is a Detroit-born Palestinian community organizer, data consultant, and Emmy award-winning poet from Detroit, Michigan. He earned his MFA in poetry from the Program for Writers at Warren Wilson College and currently serves as the development coordinator of the Offing Literary Magazine after a 2-year stint as editor of the Micro Department. His work has appeared in Vinyl Poetry, Lit Hub, Mizna, and Button Poetry, among other credits. His first collection of poetry, How the Water Holds Me, was awarded Editor's Choice by Bull City Press and is available now. So thank you so much for joining me, Tariq.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So I think that it would be really nice to hear you read some poems. So how about we hear you start by reading some poems from your book?
Yeah, so which one would you like me to read first again? I know we want to talk about some stuff. So.
Yeah, I'd love to hear you read The Summer My Cousin Went Missing, which is the opening poem in your book, and follow that up with the closing poem from your book.
All right, we'll do. Oh, so you want me to go back to back?
Yes.
Okay, got it. So the opening and the closing. Got it. The summer my cousin went missing. I should have asked how Erakat was holding up, but I knew where she would be. Her body weary and unkind, back turned to the home she grew up in, seeds in the farm soil like miracles sprouting as she tends to them. Is this not always the case? Child upon child goes and someone's mother is no longer a mother. My aunt, a mother herself, looks for a moment away. Nothing she plants has roots long enough to hold. She turns back anyways, looks ahead. If we are too caught up in the end, like boys fleeing from the day's news, however will we stay fed? However, will we live long enough to grieve? And then the last poem of the book is I go to the backyard to pick knit leaves for my mother. My mother actually made this shay with Nana. So the story for this poem I always tell people when I do events is I was the kid who never did things right away. I would always try to be efficient and be like, yeah, mom, I'm gonna do it when I go to the backyard. I'll get it later. She's like, خلاص بديش إياك تعملها. بديش إياك خلاص. And I'm like, Mama, I'm gonna do it in 5 minutes. She's like, no, I ask you now, you do it now. If you don't want to do it, خلاص بديش إياك تعملها. خلاص. So my mom would guilt me hardcore. So this poem is in her honor for that. Also, my mom was like, I'll do all these nice things for you guys and you're not gonna remember me. And I was like, Mama, you're in all my poems. So, okay. I go to the backyard to pick leaves for my mother. Today, my mouth fell wide when I saw the light slip into the hills and those boys I grew up with did not come back. Or so I hear. Mom would often ask me to gather the mint leaves from behind our home, and so I would leave for this nectar. Without it, there's nothing sweet to speak of. I pray that when I am gone, my people speak as sweetly of me as I do of them. I see us often steeped in the land and hope that a shore remains a shore, not a place to become yesterday. The girls have joined the boys now, all of them tucked just beyond the earth, but I know they wouldn't run from their mothers, not without a fight, a chase, a hunt, a honey, a home for the tea to settle, a haven for us to return to.
Thank you so much, Tariq. That was really beautiful.
Thank you.
So I have some questions specific about the book and also your perspective as a writer and as an organizer. But first, I'd like to talk a little bit about the themes that this book deals with. So you grapple with a lot of really complex and recurring themes like masculinity, its relationship to violence, displacement, diaspora, as well as interpersonal family relationships between family members. So what do you see as the driving force behind the collection? I'm sure you have a lot of poems. Why were these the ones in this collection?
Yeah, so I will say, I don't know if I have that many poems, to be honest. I have a lot of pieces of poems and they found themselves in this book. There are a couple that didn't make its way in here. And when we were first developing the book and I was talking to Bull City, the first thing they asked me, and this is advice for any writer, I guess, is do you anticipate this collection becoming a book? or do you feel like the poems in this book can be on their own and you're comfortable writing new poems? Because you don't want to do this thing where you do chapbook 2.0, right? You don't want your book to just be like your poems from the chapbook, just with like an extra EP. So for me, I was really comfortable with having these poems be the poems I put in the book, because a lot of these were written over the course of, I'd say like the first poem, the oldest poem in this book is from maybe 2014 or 15. And so for me, I really wanted this to kind of be like a timestamp of all the work that I had written prior to MFA, through the MFA, and once I graduated, because I just felt myself writing new and different work. And so I wanted to kind of get it out there, especially because it's Palestinian, like, you know, I think a couple of years ago, we hit the 70th year of the Nakba, since the Nakba. And so every year continues to get us further and further away from the moment of the catastrophe. And so I felt like the longer I waited, the more time I am the more time I'm letting myself be unheard, or letting myself be, not allowing the words to really get out there and be shared, right? As much as I love slam and all the spoken word, and I love being able to share work in live events like this, there's something to be said about putting work on the page so that way they can speak for you, when you're not there to speak for the words yourself. So, but as it pertains to the themes, I think for me, like, this was a very personal book in the sense that I look at like each of the themes, whether it be masculinity, family, land, belonging, and I think of myself as the avatar, the joint between all of those, or the fulcrum between all of those themes. And so I think a lot of people, they ask like, how do you come up with the themes, or like what inspired you? I was just like, I just wrote about my life, honestly, and I put the poems together in a way that I feel like created a story for itself. Because like that's the thing I don't think people get enough, which is every day that you are living or existing is fuel for the writing. So the fact that you are the one existing, you are already automatically creating that fulcrum for all the stories you tell. So even if like you have a story about eating pizza and then another story about like fighting oppression, those are still your story, and they do make sense, and they can fit in the same book if you're able to create the arc effectively to do so. And I feel like with my poems, I guess the one way I laid it out, just for the spark notes of it, is I actually tried to start from Palestine and work my way back to where I am today. And so if you notice, like the poems are very intentionally like Palestinian, or dealing with land, and like being in diaspora, and then they slowly work their way into more of like a localized setting. Like for example, like the swimming lessons with my father, the me flying in America, me navigating relationships with my sister here, my mother, for example, like the now not getting mint leaves is a very Arab thing, but it's a thing that we did here in Dearborn. Like my mom grew leaves in our backyard. And you know, and those, for those who don't know, Dearborn is like the little Arabia of the United States. And so we just kind of work our way back and try to find ourselves that way.
That's really awesome. I think that I'm going to go a little out of order. I sent you questions
Do your
before.
thing. It's all good.
I'm going to go a little out of order because I think you're really getting into something that's what I find so special about, you know, contemporary poetry and poetry in general, is that there are these commonplace moments in time, um, in your writing and a lot of really masterful poets' writing, that become the theme that's so much larger, right? Like the theme of diaspora. And so I even get that in your book when you're talking about, for example, you talk about a roller coaster ride, the
Yep.
flight you take, right? Sliding into someone's DMs. It's all somehow also about Palestine. So can you tell us a little bit about how and if Palestine exists in these everyday moments for you, um, and how you want to capture that?
Yeah. So I think like the first thing is so just to add to that, like while it is about Palestine, it's also not about Palestine, right? Because I don't want people to start thinking, well, oh, you're the Palestinian poet, so everything you write about is Palestine. But in the same respect, like you said, right, like because I'm Palestinian, like what I just said earlier, like actually Darine said this earlier in the panel as well, like you can't write outside of your own experience. And so anything I do write is a Palestinian thing to write. I often think a lot about how people say very dismissive things of people trying to get in touch with their culture, saying like, well, you're too X, Y, and Z for that, or you're too watered down for that. And it's like, well, honestly, if I'm of this identity and I'm doing the thing, it is now a thing that my identity does. And just because it's not customary or majority done doesn't mean it's any less Palestinian or less Black or less whatever, depending on what community you're speaking to. So when it comes to Palestine and just like the way that I guess, I feel like I lost track of the question, but I also want it to be just a Q&A where like you're just telling me things. So I guess like I'm curious, like what are things that you really enjoy that you've been seeing these past few days or these past few weeks when you've been reading stuff, or at least this whole quarantine? Because I feel like I can jump off of that too. Because if people don't know, like Ayah is an amazing writer as well, and like is a scholarship winner and all this stuff, and like I want it to be a conversation more than a Q&A.
Well, thank you for that. That's really nice of you to say. Um, yeah, I won't lie. Most of what I've been reading has been science, right, during this period of time. But there's this really wonderful moment where you get to take a break from
Yeah.
that, from what your job is or what your field is. And my break was very intentionally Susie's Against the Loveless World,
Oh yeah.
which I also have. I tell everyone that I have like a Palestine library. I think the thing that I find so important about these pieces of work are really the everyday moments of them,
Yeah. Yeah.
of like what you said exactly is Palestine is what we are because we've been scattered all over the world and within Palestine, and it lives in us at this point. I'm someone who visited Palestine for the first time a few years ago and stayed there for a little bit, but I knew that it was my home before that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's what I think is also really interesting about your book, because a lot of what you talk about is that home that you're building here.
Yeah.
That is like almost a reflection of Palestine, right? But it's yours.
Yeah.
It's the way that you've made it.
So actually, one thing that you reminded me of, I can't remember who said this, but he was a an artist from New Zealand, if I'm not mistaken, and an indigenous artist from New Zealand. He said something along the lines of like, "We are caretakers of the land because we are the land." And so I think a lot about like, and I actually that inspired me when I was thinking about a piece of poet. Like I had written like one of those like very short like Instagram poems. Not, it wasn't like this, but it was just a line. It was just a couple of lines where I was thinking about how the Trump had allowed the embassy to be moved, and I was thinking about the ways in which that was going to be a further roadblock for us as Palestinians to get our liberation. And I was thinking, um, I can't remember what it is. I was like, it was like my Facebook cover header for a while, if you remember it. And it was something along the lines of like, um, if my body is Palestinian, so everywhere I walk is Palestine, right? And so if we are Palestinian and we carry on our traditions with us, and I think that is a tremendously powerful thing to think about the ways in which anywhere we go is where we carry our people with us and we carry our histories and our cultures with us. Now, with that said, I want people to conflate it and think, well, because you can take your culture anywhere, that means you can make a new culture anywhere. I was like, no, like there is something to be said about the land in which you come from. And the thing that's beautiful to me and is what I would have hoped for and what I do envision for, because I think we talk about a lot about liberation. We don't talk about what liberation looks like. I just mentioned the New Zealand artist. When I think about the Jewish struggle as well, like there are so many non-Zionist Jewish people who understand struggle, understand displacement. And so when I think about Palestine, when I think about a free Palestine, I'm thinking about a land for so many people who've been displaced over the course of millennia, whether it be Christian, atheist, Jewish, Palestinian, Muslim, whatever. And so that is the kind of land that when we talk about free Palestine from the river to the sea, we're talking about a free land for all peoples, Palestinians included. And right now, that's not how it is. Even people within the Jewish diaspora of their own accord do not have the same freedom across the spectrum. So I think people often try to conflate this as like a religious battle or a cultural battle. It's not really. Honestly, it's about making a free space for all peoples to exist freely. So, but that's a tangent. Besides the everyday stuff. And so in the moment, I just kind of like relish in the everyday of like having shay. Like I never used to drink shay that much. I've gotten into it because like it's actually not bad. Like I like it. For a while though, it was like really bad. I kept having like really watered down shay. It just reminded me of like vitamin water. And then I also got into hummus a lot lately. But I've always been into knafa. I just didn't realize that I was eating the wrong knafa. Well, not the wrong knafa. So there's a different Ghazawi version of knafa that is not cheese related. It is like more nut based that my mom always used to make me. So I remember one time after, actually it was an event that Remy was performing at. Oh yeah, I opened for Remy and Tahani in Ann Arbor, and after we went got like pizza or something, or maybe it was just Remy, I don't know. It was in Ann Arbor at University of Michigan, and like I got into a whole debate with somebody about like knafa, and they were like saying dude, that's not what knafa. And I was like, no, 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 knafa's totally doesn't have any cheese in it. It's made like this with nuts and pistachio and sweets and whatever. And then I had to like ask my mom. She was like, oh, no, 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 you were totally wrong. That is like a Zawi version of knafa. The real knafa has cheese in it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So even the things that like between Palestinians can be different, but you know, we're from Gaza, so we're kind of cut off too. So sorry for rambling.
No, no, no worries. I think that what you got at there though, and it's something that I like that you made that distinction of really like we don't want to make it seem like we are okay with what we've gotten, right? No, we are people deserving the land and that's our fundamental right. But also for ourselves, like to keep the hope alive is to say that for all the efforts they've made to make Palestine smaller, and for all the land that they've taken away,
Mhm.
what we've done is pull it across the world.
Yep.
We've made it bigger. We put Palestine in Chile,
Yep.
right? Like it's
Yep.
everywhere.
Yep.
So I think that's really amazing. But I'm going to bring us back to your book because I really want to let it shine.
Okay.
So I want to talk a little bit about those poems that you read in the beginning.
Yes.
And in the first one, you open, and I really like what you said about arc because I really see it when I'm looking at the collection. You open with a mother's grief for a lost son in this missing cousin, and you end in this moment where you're actually missing from your mother because you're getting her mint leaves, but you're returning.
Yep.
And you think about, well, in that moment where I'm gone, how will my people remember me?
Right.
But in both cases, the focus really is on your relationship to the mother. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what that significance is in your work and your relationship with your mother as an element of your writing.
Right. So I think in a lot of ways, well, whether it be my mother or just women in general, I think for me, I've always been very reverent, as if that's even a word, and revering of the women in my life and the women who have like led the way and paved the way in so many spaces. Like I know we talk about a lot about like these freedom fighters who are like men. We talk about like Kanafani and all of these different people who are like in the pictures, they're in the black and white photos on the front lines, something like that. Aside from like Leila Khaled, of course. And so when we think about that, I don't think people realize enough the labor that women put. I mean, I know we talk about it, or at least in recent years, we've discussed it more when we fight back against misogyny, things of those nature, of that nature. But like I wouldn't be anywhere I am without my mom, right? Like I wouldn't be anywhere I am without the sacrifices she's made. And that's the other thing I want to also like speak to, where it's like I think in a lot of ways people get this, at least I've seen a lot of men get into this weird place where like they're revering the women in their lives insofar as the women have allowed them to be who they are, but then still don't let the women shine or don't acknowledge the work they need to be doing to like say like, no, like women are not simply vessels for you to be who you are. And so like as I was processing all of that, I always kept trying to talk to my mother more about like, you know, what moves her, what she's passionate about, more stories about her and her homeland and like how she existed in Gaza, how she went to school in Egypt, things of that nature. And then like, you know, I learned stories like my grandmother, my mom's mom used to be a poet herself. I think about like the ways in which none of our movement exists without women, right? And even when I was in high school, I used to be in MSA, like the Muslim Student Association. And like I was like, I think I was like president one year, and then the rest of the board was women, right? Like women are out here always doing so much and never getting any credit for it. And so for me, like when I say that the poetry is about my lived experiences, it's very much about like how can I write a story about my lived experience without the women who are also very much a part of that experience. Now, the thing that's hard for me to balance is like my mom hates when I write about her, right? Like she's like don't talk about me and don't. I was just, mom, I'm super vague. Don't worry about it. And so that is where I do have to take it away from her and kind of focus on like what women have meant for me in my own growth and my own maturation process. But yeah, I feel like for me, I'm rambling so much. But one, I'm super grateful to women. Two, I'm really grateful for my mom. Three, like I just think about so I'll go into the story. I'll do more of a close read. So this poem was the opening poem was very much about like how in 2014, I believe, I'm not sure, I can't remember which year it was, either 2014, 2016, one of the offensives launched against the people in Gaza. Um, my cousin went missing for several weeks, and he was very active in trying to like help people survive the rubble and the blasts. And so when somebody goes missing, whether it be due to curfew or the strife or whatever, those are moments where I think about my Haredi wasn't that great back then, or even when it was okay, I was still very shy. And so the idea of calling back home to check in on somebody was so nebulous to me, because I'm thinking, like, what possibly could I say to offer her solace? Like, what could I possibly say to my aunt to let her know her son is going to be okay, when, like, they themselves are living through so much that my words can't do anything for them. And so, like, that's in a lot of ways what makes me kind of a pessimistic poet, which we can probably talk about later. But yeah, so I was just trying to find ways to take the real stories that I lived through, most of them involving women, and the ways in which women have shaped my ability to be a better man, and throw those into the book. I didn't really think much of it. It just kind of happened.
Yeah, I totally hear that, especially what you were saying at the beginning of really documenting, like, your mother, and you're telling her, definitely not going to forget you also. You're a main theme in my book that I questioning me on.
Right, and like to be fair, like, I'm still not a great son. I'm not that much. I could be so much better. Like, I could do things like get the nana faster, right? There's things I could be better at doing, and I acknowledge the fact that I'm not as good as I want to be as a son. But I think to that point, there's nothing wrong with starting late, or doing your best to do that work. Because I think, and this is where my brother and my sister get on me sometimes. They're always like, well, you're always on social media advocating for all these things, but at home you're super lazy. And I was like, y'all, like, I do the thing I'm supposed to do when I'm supposed to do it. Like, I'm not lazy. I'm just like, I'm doing things on my own time. And so, but that's just me being at home much later than I needed to. They're traditional. They're like, you're not supposed to move out till you're married. And I'm just like, if I'm, I live as though I don't live here sometimes, mostly because I move around so much. So it's weird to juggle. My bad. I will say this, just so I'm not complete, so people don't think I'm completely lazy. My whole thing was, when we think about teams and we think about, like, labor and the pattern of labor, I'm like the only one in my family who's very active in the community. And so for me, well, besides my mother, she's actually very active with the PCRF here as well. But they do a couple events a year, whereas, like, I'm in meetings with different community members every single day. And so my logic is always like, I could do the dishes right away, or I could help implement policy in Detroit. And so I'm like, dishes, policy, but to be fair, I have to be better at both. So yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. That's
I'm trying to be transparent.
I also want to, yeah, that's very transparent. I also want to talk definitely about your community organizing work. Before I do that, though, we have our wonderful participants who have tuned in for this. And I forgot to mention at the beginning that we have a Q&A open. So please throw your questions in the Q&A if you think, like, there's something that you really want an answer to, that I'm not asking. I would love to ask that. And we'll do a formal Q&A at the end, but just a heads up.
I'll also try to be faster. I know we have 20 minutes left, and we already have, like, a big thing to talk through. So I'll try to have shorter answers to y'all. Also, I can't see any of the questions I asked, so you'll have to read them all.
Don't worry, I'll read them all to you. I got you. Okay, so I want to bring you back to the book again. Yeah. I want you to read Al-Bahr. Yeah. And I really want to talk about one particular line. So you read that book, that poem. I'm going to tell you what line it was.
I got you. All right. Oh, I can't find it. Where are you?
It's on page 28.
Oh, thank you. I found it as you said that. Al-Bahr. I have seen death look like me. Bones sprawled out somewhere between hazel-coated grains along the beach of the Red Sea shore, a palm open and a palm closed, body thick as a fist in waning rose crimson tides. Still, I've never known a law to rewind a bullet or a bomb, to unwind a spine too busy wrapped around grief. I'm told we must learn to speak with its tongue, too mired in the end. Do you read? Have you heard? I have seen it all before. I watch men who don't, and sometimes do look like me, print tomorrow's face with my mother's graves. I'm incoherent at this point, but I once saw a boy that could have become me washed up on a shore. Along another, I watched all the boys lose a match. I guess I'm not putting enough blame on the child. Don't get me wrong. I'm just wondering, can a boy find death and not come bringing it home to show everyone what he's found?
Wow. It's those last few lines. Don't get me wrong. I'm just wondering, can a boy find death and not bring it home to show everyone what he's found?
Yep.
This is the line that really strikes me, and I think in reading this collection multiple times, it's the one that always stands out to me, because I want to hear a little bit more about your perspective on Palestinian masculinity in particular, and the theme of grief throughout the collection, of just what is it, do you think, that that causes us to bring our death home?
Yeah, I mean, I think so in a lot of ways. So this poem was also a very pan-Arab poem. The first reference is to the boy Aylan Kurdi, the Syrian refugee, and then the second was to the four Baraka boys who were killed on the beach playing soccer. And so I think for me, when I think about like masculinity, I think about all these beautiful ways in which like boys mature to be a more these vibrant creative things, but then have that, and not just boys, like girls as well, but like they have this oddly it's like putting a child in a pressure cooker, right? And that's what I think about with death when I think about the ways in which if all you ever grow up around is violence or seeing violence be taken against you, one of two things happens: either you desensitize to it, or you yourself devalue yourself or start to become devalued, either psychologically. And Daddy actually said this earlier, right? We psychologically imprison ourselves as well. And so when I think about grief, I don't just grieve the body's loss. I grieve the loss of futures, the loss of potential, the loss of joy, the loss of free existence. I mean, for myself, I think the last time I was in Gaza when I was 16 years old. So it was about 13 years ago now. And so when I was in Gaza, I was playing basketball with these kids who I never knew could even play basketball. Like, I didn't even know basketball was a thing in Gaza that we did. But they were some of the best basketball players I ever played with. But juxtaposed against that, us playing in this like very worn down Melahab, which is a recreation center, like an outdoor recreation center, you have like F-16 fighters just flying overhead doing sonic booms to remind you where you are and who you are. And so if all you ever do is see death or experience death, then even if you're not bringing home, so on one level, bringing home death is bringing home the body, the martyr, the person who's been killed. But in another way, it's also bringing home the memory of that person, the weight that comes with knowing that everybody around you is now deceased or becoming deceased, or you yourself are slowly dying in every stuff, slowly dying yourself. And so like, obviously we all are closer to death each and every single minute. Like we're all dying slowly, but some of us are dying more quickly than others. Some of us are dead upon arrival. And when I grieve, I don't just grieve like the loss of the life, I grieve the loss of the ability to thrive. And so I think a lot of people talk about, we're very resilient people, but I'm tired of us being resilient, right? Like, I don't want us to just be able to survive. I don't want us to just be like, yes, like in Gaza, unemployment is so crazy, or it's just so wildly untenable. Water is unclean, access to resources is ridiculously woeful. And so those are things I grieve as well, right? I grieve that we cannot play basketball freely. I grieve that we cannot cross a border freely. I grieve that we cannot have a simple conversation in diaspora, even in diaspora, without in some way being told, well, your existence is resistance. And I was like, well, I want my existence to be more than that. My existence is, yes, resistance for sure, but it's not just that. And that actually goes to another line in the poem, in the book. I said these two lines at the beginning of We Already Know This, which is, there is more to us than what was taken from us. And what I fear as a culture more than anything is, as we get further and further away from the point in which we had land to really freely exhibit, we start to lose those stories as our elders die off. And then our narrative and our culture becomes strictly existence is resistant, right? People start to say, they start to look at you in antithesis to the occupation. When in reality, we've always had a culture prior to occupation. We'll have a culture during the occupation. We'll have a culture after the occupation. And so I think part of genocide that people don't understand is genocide is not just the body. It's not just the presence. Genocide is also the killing of culture, the erasure of your history from the minds of the people who are growing up in each new generation. And I'm rambling hardcore, but hopefully us writing and creating books not just myself, but you as well, and Susan, and all these people, we're creating an archive so that way we never forget those stories. And even if our elders pass on, we don't just think of ourselves as existing to resist. We exist to thrive and to share and joy, to create art and create beautiful things that wouldn't be able to be exhibited in this world without our people existing.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right. And I think that a lot of what we're doing, to give a little bit of a shout out here at Palestine Writes, is that we have
Yep.
like people who are teaching Tatreez, Wafat from
Yep.
Tatreez and Tea. We have
Yep.
a lot of this discussion about a lot of these books cover what happened before, right?
Yep.
And how we connected with one another. And I think that what is really, really particularly beautiful about our culture is it's not just resilience, but it's also that, we have something really worth passing. That's why they keep trying to take it from us. We have something
Yep.
really worth
Yep.
passing off to one another. Our debkit is rooted in farming practices, and
Yep.
our storytelling is rooted in familial collection. So I think that's a really great point. Can you talk about, do you think that you've been like, do you think a lot of your writing or any of your writing really comes from those discussions with an elder or with the stories that might have been passed down to you?
So the hard thing is, and this is also what goes back to what goes back to the genocide of our culture, or the attempted genocide of our culture. I haven't had the privilege of speaking with many elders. I have in the States, like in the organizing work I do, there's a tremendous wealth of elders to reach into. But that's the other thing, like some of them are pretty cynical these days, right? Because they've existed through some of the worst of what our struggle has shown. And so you get a lot of really beautiful stories, but a lot of the stories are going back to resilience, because they really want to share the strife they've gone through. The closest I can get is maybe my father, my mother telling me of their parents, because I didn't speak Arabic well enough. And also, like my grandparents passed away when I was very young. And so those stories I would have been able to glean from them, I can't have anymore. And so all the stories I'm getting are secondhand about my grandparents from my parents. And so what I've been trying to be more intentional about is trying to get those stories from my parents. So that way, when my children, if I have children, ask me those questions, I can offer those answers in a more pristine fashion. But even then, it's like, my mom is like also intensely religious. She's very, very Muslim. And so for her, a lot of things are like, she cares more about Islamic culture than Palestinian culture. And those are weaved in some ways they're not. But like when you have to rely on a few people to be the elders that tell you all your stories, you have to find more elders, a bigger sample size, or you have to rely on books and other things like that to tell you the stories that you feel like you couldn't grasp otherwise. So I wish I had more elders to tap into for these narratives, but I think for me, that's why this book is actually it seems very contemporary and very modern in the sense that it's all me as the lens by which I experience the world around me. I mean, I have a poem in here about DMing somebody. My elders have never DM'd somebody in their lives. So that's, one thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that that's also, we definitely want to write down these stories, but we also, of course, want to respect where the stories come from, right? So there is also something to be said about the way that we experience our lives being different, and that's it. Not being different and worse or different, but just different. And so how can we connect on that basis? I mean, it's something that definitely with my own family, I continue to hope to do. My favorite thing is listening to my grandpa. Doesn't tell stories, he tells jokes, and he's
Ah,
hilarious. Um, well, so a lot of the things that you've talked about today also is that you not only identify as a writer, but also as a community organizer. And I want to know, how does your love for poetry influence your organizing and vice versa? Did one come before the other? Are they interlinked? Denny talks about this a little bit today, of course, but I'm wondering your perspective in America.
yeah, so for me, I think, so I used to be the kid when I was really young. My parents would take me to the protests, and like we would walk down Schaefer and Dearborn, and just like we'd be having the flags on us and chanting and everything of that nature. And so I felt like that was kind of like an introduction to the rich history of resistance that we have as Palestinian. But the one thing I think for me is that I always was a writer before I was a poet. So I used to write like short stories. I used to read a lot as well. And so for me, I never really poetry is actually later in the game for me. I was always like a volunteer. I used to work at like hospitals and volunteer with the kids and things of that nature. But then when I got older, I got more I think invested in the political realm, and by political I mean more social justicey spaces where we were trying to make changes to policy and infrastructure that would afford us the freedoms that we're fighting for. And so right now I do a lot of work in Detroit with different disability rights organizations. Prior to that, I was doing a lot of work with Palestinian youth movement. Prior to that, I was doing a lot of work on campus in college with sexual violence prevention. And so I actually got back into community organizing because of the work on campus, where we were doing a lot of work to help teach people what sexual assault looks like, how to prevent sexual assault, how to teach men not to be rapists, things of that nature. And so, when we talk about masculinity, for me, it started off like way earlier than the writing did. I started slamming when I was like 18 or 19, but the work of trying to make men be more mindful of the world that they're exhibiting and existing in started prior to that for me. And so for me, in a lot of ways, whether it was as a Palestinian or as a man or whatever, poetry became the tool I used to leverage um, I kind of say this. I think people say they think of the word deception and they think of it negatively, but deception is merely just like the obfuscating of a path. And so when I think of poetry, I think of it as a very artistic deception in the sense that I could say, hey, read this article about why you shouldn't be a trash person, or here, read this, this policy proposal on why Palestinians deserve rights. Or I could say, here's a poem, here's a story, and then within the story, I'm packaging a narrative and a way of thinking and believing that I think is much more easier received. Because if I tell somebody, hey, listen to a song or listen to this 3-minute poem, you're much better off getting them to receive you and invite your narrative into them than you are if you tell them, hey, I'm going to teach you something about yourself that you need to hear, and it's not going to be sugarcoated at all. So poetry was definitely a tool of journalism for me without necessarily having a journalistic label on it. And so community organizing, as it stands today, I like to use my poetic skills to kind of help tell stories and build connections among communities. But for me, I mean, I don't even, if I could trade poetry and never write again, I would definitely do it if it meant for like a free Palestine. Like if you could tell me that this is the path by which you could follow and you could liberate all the people you could possibly liberate in this pathway, and you never have to touch a poem, I would do that thing. Poetry for me is a tool to help liberate people. And so, like I said earlier in the panel, I got into poetry to make friends, make connections, meet new people, and then tell stories. Um, if there was another better way to do that, I would do it. But I don't see a better way. Like that's the thing. Like I just don't see a better way than to augment the tangible work with the stories we tell, and then augment the stories we tell with the tangible work. I also couldn't justify being a writer who just writes stories and doesn't put his actual blood in the work, because then it's like I just don't feel comfortable. I often say this, which is like we are standing on the shoulders of our ancestors. And so I don't feel like I can do justice to these narratives if I'm not also doing the work that they did without the stories. I'm lucky. Like I live in the States, well, Turtle Island. I live here and I'm free from strife. I'm free from the possibility of being shelled by the IDF. And so it is my duty to take this relative privilege and tell these stories as best I can. So if I don't, I mean, basically, I just think I'm lucky. Like I think anybody could tell these stories if they were in my position. And so because I am here, I have to tell these stories. I have to do this work. If I was in Gaza, I'd be doing very different work probably, but still telling stories and still trying to find a way to make it all in some kind of tapestry.
So I hate to do a little journalist twisting your words on you thing today.
Okay.
But I have a question. So you're saying you're getting into this thing that's really important, which is art and poetry as a tool. Oh my God, did I scare him away? Oh, your video is
No.
back. Poetry as a tool. But earlier you were saying that when you write
Yes.
for yourself.
Yes.
So are you writing lessons that you would want to teach yourself? or are you using your own lessons to teach others? Like there's a little bit of a disconnect between those two answers. I'm wondering if you
Yeah, so what I meant to say by that is I share for others, right? So for me, what I was trying to say was, um, if you write poetry strictly for an audience, you're never going to satiate them or yourself. And so if I just wrote these poems because I wanted somebody else to read them and they didn't actually serve me, then I just wasted all my time writing a book that doesn't please me, that doesn't serve me. And so when I say that I don't want to write for others, but also in the same way use it as a tool, for me, it's more like I should have been more specific and said I share as a tool for journalism, right? So I think there's two parts of the writing process. We write for ourselves, and by ourselves, I very much mean me, right? Like I needed to write these stories because nobody else was going to write the story I needed to see except for myself. And so I wrote it for myself, but I put it on a page and I shared it with other people because I felt like there were pieces of it that would resonate with others. And so I think the act of sharing is the journalistic part of it. The act of writing it is something. So when I say I would give up poetry, I'm not going to give up writing because writing is something that's very cathartic to me. But if you told me like you don't have to publish poems, you don't have to put a book out, you can just write for yourself to stay sane, I would have definitely done that and done other work if I could have. I just feel like the act of sharing, even if it puts me on lists that prevent me from getting into Palestine again, is still worth the risk. So those are the things I think about with that. And also, I know there's probably other people who want to ask questions. I don't know if you want to go over or not. I don't know if we can, but yeah, I'm sorry I rambled so much.
No, no worries. Yes, people definitely have questions here. I wasn't getting the notification. I'm so sorry to our audience. Let's hear about, um, someone says, will you tell us about the writing programs you attended? How were they helpful and how were they frustrating? And
It's-
we do have limited time to answer this question. I'm so sorry.
Can you tell me a bunch of questions and then I'll get it. I'll try to see if I can go through them really quick.
Yes, okay. Do you think Palestinian male bodies carry more inherited anger with the need to use our bodies as survival, resistance weapons? What do you think of toxic masculinity among Palestinian men and the impact it has on Palestinian women? And what is the spectrum of activism that comes from Palestine in your experience in organizing?
Okay, those are so in depth that obviously they deserve so many more minutes than I have. So I'll just say I went to Warren Wilson for my MFA program. It was a low residency program. I did it because I could keep my full time job while doing it. I had some really amazing experiences, met some really amazing mentors like Gabby Calvacaresi, Cedella Young, Martha Rhodes. But in the same respect, I did the MFA because I actually taught myself everything about poetry that I knew, and I really wanted to have a more institutionalized or maybe not institutionalized, a more formalized education. I wanted to really read and learn from people who could tell me that is what a stress is. That is what a metaphor is. Because I could hear it. My poems are very poetic, or they're very sound oriented. Like all of my poetry like works sonically, but I didn't know how to explain the sounds I was making or the tools I was using. I equated to a guitar player learning how to play guitar by sound. And so I wanted to kind of know the definitions of the sounds I was making. When it comes to masculinity, all I'll say is there's a poem in the book called Portrait of My Father Drowning. And the reason I wrote that poem and part of what that inspired me for is that I think, yes, there's so much toxicity in masculinity, but there's so much toxicity just in being a person in general, just being a human being in this capitalistic, messed up world. And so I think men have to do a lot of work to unpack that. But I think in the same respect, we need to find ways to also afford them space to be able to do that work of unpacking. Right? When I think about my father, him and I clash a lot, but while I do clash with him, I'm not free I'm not absolved because like I sometimes have a tantrum or I sometimes have a temper with him when I don't realize like this is a man who grew up for almost 30 years in an open air prison, right? And so the same way I want to hold him accountable as a 60-year-old man now for the things that he does that clash with me, I also have to be mindful of the fact that his upbringing. And so when we talk about like inherited toxicity, that is a condition of existing in an occupation. That is a condition of existing in a capitalistic world that is commodifying each of us, right? And so I think about it in so many different realms. People are just not allowed to be people. And so if we're going to talk about people being healed, we have to think about transformative justice processes, not just restorative justice processes. And those are really hard to come across. The last thing I'll say is, yeah, thank you all for listening to me ramble for an hour or so. Thank you, Aya, for hosting this. And feel free to email me if you have any other questions. I'm sure we'll do more of this in the future. I'm also on a couple other calls before the end of the year, so I'm pretty accessible. Feel free to follow Twitter, Instagram, all that stuff.
Thank you so much, Tariq. I'm going to just say again, the book is called How the Water Holds Me and is available in the bookstore. And Tariq, I don't think has mentioned this, but you donate some of these proceeds to Palestine, right?
Yeah, all the profits we make on the royalties on the book, for example, all go to Peace RFs, Visualizing Palestine, etc. I don't do this to make money, y'all. I have a full-time job, alhamdulillah. Like, I'm lucky to have a full-time job. The money I get from the books, any profits I get, royalty profits I give to organizations. So also, if it doesn't go directly to an organization, it goes for me to be able to buy food for the organizations I work with here in Detroit too. So we have pizza parties, or at least we used to.
So thank you so much, everyone. I hope you'll take a chance to grab the book as well. Thank you for being here. I'm sorry I went over. Have a great night.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Aya.